Founders have dictatorized companies. Back on September 16, 1985, Steve Jobs was fired from his own company, Apple. Fans like to argue that this was completely unjust and unfair, and from a moral perspective, they may be right. It is unfair to kick out a founder from their own company, but it was also the right decision. While Apple did get destroyed over the next decade, Steve Jobs had the opportunity to grow as a leader, a family man, and as a visionary. And when he returned 12 years later, he was able to make Apple into the world's largest company. Looking back, even Jobs himself has agreed that getting fired was the medicine that he needed. This isn't to say that all founders should be fired from their companies to be grounded and put in their place. But what it does show is that even the smartest minds in the world are just straight up wrong from time to time. And this is precisely why large public companies have boards, chairmen, shareholders, and an entire executive team. The idea is that there is a system of checks and balances that ensures that no single person becomes too powerful, but this is no longer the case. Modern companies still have boards and investors and executive teams, but all of that is just for show. At the end of the day, the person who has all the power is the founder or founders. Now, this is no problem if we're talking about a private company or the given founders have a stake of over 50%. But with modern tech giants, neither of these are the case. Take Mark Zuckerberg, for example. Over the past few years, he's been gambling tens of billions on the metaverse, something that investors haven't exactly been excited about. To make things worse, much of the launched metaverse products have flopped beyond belief, boasting as little as just 38 users. All of this has given Zuckerberg a favorability rating of just 22%, or only half of even Donald Trump. This is precisely the type of situation in which a CEO would be fired, but Mark doesn't have to worry about that. You see, Mark only owns 13.6% of Meta, not much more than Steve Jobs' stake of 11% when he was fired. So, nowhere near a majority, but see, modern founders have learned from their predecessors. They know what can happen if they give away majority control. So while they may give away a majority stake in their company, they never give away majority control. How, you ask? Well, they've brilliantly made a distinction between equity and voting power. While Zuckerberg only owns 13% of Meta, he controls 54% of its voting power. A similar story can be seen with Google. At this point, Larry Page only owns 6.1% and Sergey Brin only owns 5.7%. But together, they control 51.2% of Google's voting power. This means that despite having single-digit stakes, this duo has ultimate control of a $1.3 trillion company with 180,000 employees, tens of millions of investors, and billions of users, as this is the story of how founders abused their power. This is the story of how founders dictatorized companies. The root of modern-day founders' power is thanks to multiple classes of stock with different voting power. Class A stock might come along with 1 vote per share, while Class B stock comes along with 10 votes per share. The average investor doesn't even realize this, but many companies actually have different classes of stock on the public market itself. Likely the best example of this is none other than Google. If you look up Google on your brokerage, you may come across the following listing: Alphabet Inc. Class C, ticker symbol GOOG. At first glance, it looks like Google stock. The market cap checks out, the PE ratio checks out, the price looks about right, and that's because it is technically Google stock. But what it isn't is Google stock with voting rights. This means that you can buy 1 billion of these shares and invest $100 billion, but you wouldn't even get a single vote. If you want voting power, you need to buy Alphabet Inc. Class A stock or ticker symbol GOOGL. Basically, everything about this share is identical to the Class C shares, except you'll get 1 vote for every share that you own. But the shares that you really want are Class B shares. With Class B shares, you get 10 votes for every share you own. But you can look all you want on any brokerage you can find. but you'll never find Class B Google shares. This is because Class B shares are reserved for founders, VC firms, and other close insiders. Most investors don't look into this too much. They figure that their 1,000 or even 100,000 votes won't really make a difference at Google. And they're right, as an individual they can't really make a difference at these companies. But the fact that 1 or 2 people have all the votes that everyone else gives up does make a difference. And that's why multi-class stock structures were banned for over 50 years. You see, dual-class and multi-class stock, or DCS, are by no means a new invention. It's actually been around for well over 100 years, but it was a frowned-upon invention. The first American company to issue multi-class stock was the International Silver Company back in 1898. Originally, this wasn't considered to be a big deal. Founders wanted a bit more control over their companies. And given that information wasn't nearly as accessible as it is today, it made sense for investors to be more passive. But over time, founders started becoming more and more aggressive. What started off as 1 extra vote became 5 extra votes, and then 10 extra votes, and then 20 extra votes. This practice only became worse with the roaring 1920s as everyday people started buying stocks. They didn't care about voting shares or earnings reports. They just wanted to be a part of the Rockefeller fortune or the Ford fortune. This gave companies plenty of room to test the boundaries until one company pushed it way too far, Dodge Motor Company. In 1925, Dodge would have one of the most infamous IPOs of all time. They would exclusively issue shares with absolutely no voting power. This meant that insiders could own just a single share of stock and retain 100% voting power, and that's pretty much what they did too. The insiders owned just 1.7% of the company, but they had absolute control over the company. Investors were obviously pissed, and this led to an uproar on Wall Street. The New York Stock Exchange would end up siding with investors, and in 1926, they would officially ban dual-class stock. This is where the story should have ended, but this practice has not only been revived, but it has taken over the market once again. Throughout the next 54 years, the stock market operated perfectly fine. Billionaire founders were made, millionaire investors were made, and everyone had completely forgotten that dual-class stock was even a thing. But this would all change on February 8, 1971. This was the day that the Nasdaq was created. If you're not familiar with the Nasdaq, you should check out our video about them. But long story short, they technologified the stock market. Before the Nasdaq, investors had to call stockbrokers at the NYSE to place buy and sell orders, and everything would be done manually. But with the Nasdaq, the entire stock market was slowly made electronic, paving the road for how it is today. This was obviously the superior technology, but investors weren't impressed. They couldn't care less if quotes and trades were electronic or not. In fact, they preferred to call a broker that they knew and trusted for 20 or 30 years. So, despite offering great tech, the Nasdaq struggled to get investors throughout the 1970s. To make things worse, the NYSE had started ripping off Nasdaq's tech, and they were rapidly modernizing their own systems. So, things looked pretty bleak for the Nasdaq. Investors weren't using the exchange, and their main advantage was rapidly disappearing. So, in the early 1980s, they would decide to pivot their strategy. Instead of trying to attract investors, they started going after companies. If companies were exclusively listed on the Nasdaq, investors had no choice but to buy through the Nasdaq. With that, the Nasdaq started charging far lower fees than the NYSE for companies, and they still do this to this day, but this too didn't work. You see, there was a certain prestige and heritage to the NYSE. JP Morgan Chase wasn't gonna switch exchanges just because you charged less. So the Nasdaq was back to ground zero. They were worse off actually, as they were now earning lower fees as well. Throughout all of this, the Nasdaq couldn't help but notice that one exchange was actually succeeding at taking on the NYSE, the Amex, not American Express, but the American Stock Exchange. One of the main factors that distinguished the Amex from the NYSE was their policy on dual-class stock. The Amex allowed for DCS with a voting ratio of up to 10-1. The Nasdaq didn't have any DCS restrictions to begin with, but now they knew that this was precisely what they needed to lean into. There were two target markets with this strategy. The first was tech companies who were fearful that investors weren't really informed on tech, which was very much true at the time. The second was companies that were targets of corporate ratings. If these companies were able to distinguish between ownership and voting power, they could protect themselves from corporate raiders. Given that corporate rating was at its peak throughout the 80s and that tech stocks would go vertical in the 90s, the Nasdaq would also go vertical. Seeing this, companies listed on the NYSE would threaten to switch to the Nasdaq if they didn't allow for DCS. And with that, the NYSE had no choice but to unban DCS in 1986. With that being said though, companies were pretty reasonable in the early days. In fact, some notable Nasdaq companies didn't even opt for dual-class shares like Apple and Microsoft. But there's always someone who ruins it for everyone else, and in the case of dual-class stock, it was our good old friends Google and Facebook. Nowadays, most tech companies opt for a dual-class structure because, why wouldn't they? The average investor isn't even aware of it. The practice has been normalized, and it gives founders ultimate control. It's one of those things where it's like, if no one is opposing it, why would you not do it? Some notable tech companies who have adopted this practice are Snapchat, Dropbox, Lyft, Kayak, Robinhood, Coinbase, Zoom, Roku, and TripAdvisor. But this practice is by no means limited to tech companies. Some legacy companies leveraging DCS include Coca-Cola, Ford, Nike, Levi, and Hyatt Hotels. Also, don't bet on media companies to report on this issue, as the most notable ones leverage it themselves, including the New York Times, Fox News, CBS, and Comcast. And there are of course extreme examples as well. The Ford family, for example, owns 4% of the stock but controls 40% of the voting power. Similarly, EchoStar CEO Charlie Ergen owns 5% of the company but controls 90% of the vote. So let's just say things have gotten pretty bad, but I do want to point out some notable exceptions, starting with Amazon. While Jeff Bezos gets a bunch of critique for his practices, this is not one of them. It turns out that he's actually pretty loyal to shareholders. Another exception is Elon Musk and Tesla. In fact, this is why Elon was able to be forced to give up his chairman position back in 2018. And as for a startup that's going against the trend, we have Uber. So the good news is that some companies are doing the right thing. Also, the S&P 500 is putting up some resistance as well. Starting in 2017, they ruled that companies with multi-class stock will no longer be added to the S&P 500. This is the main reason that many notable startups like Snapchat have been unable to join the index despite their size. And given that index fund investing is on the rise, newer companies will very much be losing out if they're not part of the index. Will this be enough to stop their practice altogether? Probably not, but it is a step in the right direction. Did you realize how these founders were monopolizing voting power? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you would like to see more videos about the inner workings of the tech world. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.